The wind in Silver Bend, Montana, had a taste. It was a gritty concoction of pine dust from the lumber mill, metallic red dirt from the endless plains, and the sharp, subterranean breath of the silver and gold mines that ringed the valley like a crown of thorns. On this day, late in the decade of the 1870s, the wind also carried the smell of roasted corn and cheap whiskey, the sounds of a wheezing concertina, and the boisterous laughter of miners flush with a week's pay. It was the annual town fair, a brief, riotous pause in the relentless toil of digging wealth from the uncharitable earth. From her post beside the ore kilns, Alma Reyes could see it all. The fair was a splash of chaotic color against the town's monochrome backdrop of weathered gray wood and dusty brown streets. At 23, Alma's world was usually defined by the heat of the drying ovens and the steam rising from the vats of stew she served at the Cartwright and Company mess station. She was a slight figure, made leaner by a diet that was more often than not the leftover scraps from the miners' plates. Her father, a proud man from a land of sun and bright colors, had been swallowed by a tunnel collapse 3 years prior. Her mother, a woman whose spirit had been leached away by the relentless Montana cold and a grief too heavy to carry, had joined a wagon train bound for the warmer promises of New Mexico a year later, leaving Alma with nothing but a worn rosary and the hollow ache of abandonment. Now, her home was a cot in the back of the church kitchen, a charity granted by the sharp-eyed but kind Sister May. The sister saw the steel that braced Alma's slender frame, the fierce, unyielding light in her dark eyes that refused to be extinguished by hardship. Alma felt the weight of that charity every morning, a stone in the pit of her stomach. She was ashamed of the threadbare state of her dress, of the constant gnawing hunger, and of the whispers that sometimes followed her, whispers that tasted of prejudice against her Mexican blood. She was a half-breed, a stray, a creature of the town's margins. Her only goals were simple and stark: to survive, to remain beyond reproach, and to one day be free of the pitying glances. She watched the crowd ebb and flow. She saw Barrett Sloan, owner of the rival North Star mine, moving through the throng with a practiced smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. He was a man who dressed in city clothes, a stark contrast to the rough-spun wool and denim of the miners he employed. Beside him, a hulking presence in a sweat-stained hat, was Sheriff Pike. The lawman was a creature of appetites, his gut straining the buttons of his vest, his face perpetually flushed. Pike made no secret of his disdain for immigrants, Mexicans in particular, and his loyalty was for sale to the highest bidder, a fact everyone in Silver Bend knew and most accepted as just another of life's harsh realities. Then she saw him, Levi Cartwright. Even in the bustle of the fair, he seemed to occupy a space of profound stillness. At 35, he was the undisputed king of Silver Bend, the owner of the richest gold seams in the territory, a widower. He was a man carved from the same hard granite as the mountains that loomed over them. He seldom spoke, and when he did, his words were like freshly minted coins, weighty, precise, and without embellishment. He was known to be ruthlessly fair, a man who paid his workers on time and expected a full day's labor in return. He lived in a large, functional house at the head of his mining camp, Cartwright Gulch, where he was raising the 3 young children his sister had left behind when she and her husband succumbed to fever. Alma had only ever seen him from a distance, a remote figure of immense power, his face a mask of quiet, unreadable sorrow. He was talking to Nellie Hart, the proprietor of the Golden Slipper Saloon. Nellie, a woman with a past as colorful as the painted roses on her establishment's windows, laughed at something he said, a rare sound that made several heads turn. A murmur went through the crowd, a subtle shift in the day's rhythm. The Cartwright and Company gold wagon was making its way down the main street. It was a monthly ritual, the transport of the refined gold from the company safe to the assay office. The wagon was little more than a reinforced box on wheels, drawn by 2 sturdy mules and flanked by 4 armed guards. It was a display of wealth that both awed and rankled the people of Silver Bend. It was their labor, their sweat and blood, locked away in that box. Alma was pulling a fresh loaf of bread from the outdoor oven she used for the mess when the first gunshot cracked through the air. It was sharp and loud, silencing the concertina mid-wheeze. A woman screamed. Another shot followed. Then a volley. Chaos erupted. The crowd scattered like startled quail, diving behind wagons and water troughs. Alma pressed herself back against the hot brick of the oven, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the swirling red dust, she saw masked figures, 4 of them. They had appeared as if from the earth itself, moving with a brutal efficiency. 2 of the guards were down, motionless in the dirt. The other 2 were disarmed, their hands forced into the air. One of the bandits threw a length of rope over a high crossbeam of the livery stable, the other end cinched tight around the lockbox. With a great heave from the men and a coordinated pull from their horses, the heavy box was ripped from the wagon bed, crashing to the ground with a splintering thud. The whole affair took less than a minute. They loaded the smaller, heavier strongbox onto a pack horse, fired one last volley into the air to sow more panic, and spurred their mounts out of town, vanishing as quickly as they had come. The silence they left behind was thick and heavy, broken only by the whimpering of a frightened child and the groans of one of the wounded guards. People slowly emerged from their hiding places, their faces pale with shock. Alma's training, the simple instinct to help, took over. She ran toward the street, toward the fallen men. "Get back, everyone, stay back." Sheriff Pike's voice boomed across the square. He had, by some remarkable coincidence, been just inside the saloon and now took charge of the scene with a blustering display of authority. He lumbered toward the center of the chaos, his eyes scanning the crowd. Alma was kneeling beside one of the guards, trying to staunch the flow of blood from his shoulder with a piece of her apron. Pike's gaze swept past the wounded, past the splintered wagon, and settled, with a dreadful finality, on her. He pointed a thick, trembling finger. "You, the Reyes girl!" Alma looked up, confused, the blood on her hands suddenly feeling cold. "Sherifa, I saw you," he declared, his voice ringing with false certainty for all to hear. "You were right here, too close. You gave them a signal." A collective gasp went through the onlookers. Alma felt 100 pairs of eyes fix on her. She rose slowly to her feet, her own eyes wide with disbelief and a rising tide of fear. "What, no? I was at the ovens. I came to help." "I know what I saw," Pike insisted, stepping toward her. His shadow fell over her, immense and suffocating. He was playing to the crowd, to their fears and their latent prejudices. A Mexican girl, a nobody, the perfect scapegoat. You were watching the wagon, waiting. You were under arrest for complicity in armed robbery. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. The humiliation was a physical blow, hot and sharp. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. It was ludicrous, impossible. Yet in the fear and confusion of the moment, the seed of doubt was planted. "This is a mistake," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I did nothing." "Tell it to the circuit judge," Pike sneered, already starting to drag her toward the town's small, squalid jailhouse. "If you live that long." "Let her go, Sheriff." The voice was quiet, yet it cut through the noise of the square like a razor. It was Levi Cartwright. He had moved from the edge of the crowd, stepping into the cleared space with an unnerving calm. His face was devoid of expression, but his eyes, the color of a winter sky, were fixed on Pike's hand on Alma's arm. Pike stopped, momentarily thrown off balance. "This is official business. Cartwright, stay out of it." "You have no proof," Levi stated. It was not a question. "I have an eyewitness," Pike blustered. "Me. That's all the proof I need to hold her." Levi took another step closer. He was not a large man, but he possessed an intensity, a coiled stillness that seemed to take up all the air around him. "What's her bail?" Pike blinked, stunned. Bail. There is no bail for armed robbery. There is always bail. Pike, you just have to set the price high enough to look convincing, Levi said, his voice dropping lower, a dangerous edge creeping into it. So, what is it? $500, $1,000. $1,000. The sum was astronomical. More money than most men in Silver Bend would see in 5 years. The crowd gasped again, this time in astonishment. Pike's greedy little eyes widened. The wheels were turning in his head, weighing the satisfaction of jailing Alma against the sudden, incredible prospect of $1,000 in cash. 5,000, Pike said, his voice raspy with avarice. He named an impossible sum, a figure meant to end the conversation. Levi did not flinch. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a thick leather wallet. He counted out a sheaf of banknotes and coin certificates, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He held the money out to the dumbfounded sheriff. "My clerk will bring a receipt for you to sign," Levi said calmly. "I am posting her bond. She will be remanded into my custody." Pike stared at the money as if mesmerized, then snatched it from Levi's hand. He released Alma's arm so abruptly that she stumbled. Levi put out a hand to steady her, his touch surprisingly gentle on her elbow. "You cannot do this," Pike sputtered, his authority crumbling. "She's a material witness, a suspect." "Which is why I will be taking her to my camp," Levi replied smoothly, turning his back on the sheriff. "To protect the witness, I'm sure you understand. Sheriff, we would not want anything to happen to her before she has a chance to tell her story. Would we?" He began to lead Alma away, his hand still lightly on her elbow, guiding her through the stunned and parting crowd. She was dizzy, her mind reeling. Levi Cartwright, the town's phantom king, had just purchased her freedom for a fortune. She could feel the heat of his hand through the thin fabric of her sleeve, a steady, grounding pressure in a world that had just spun violently off its axis. They were almost clear of the crowd when a man shouted, "Sheriff, look at this!" One of the deputies was holding up the length of rope the robbers had used to pull the strongbox from the wagon. He pointed to the knot that connected it to a broken harness strap. "It's a kiln hitch," the deputy announced, his voice carrying in the sudden silence, the kind they used to secure the doors on the ore dryers, a double figure-8 bend. Alma froze. Her blood ran cold. Sister May had taught her that very knot just last week, complaining that the old ones were always coming loose. Alma had spent the morning practicing it on scraps of rope, her fingers clumsy at first, then more sure. It was a specialized knot, uncommon outside of the specific work of the kilns. Every head turned toward her. The whispers started again, no longer uncertain, but sharp and venomous. It was not just Pike's accusation anymore. It was evidence, a rope, a knot, a direct link from the brutal robbery to the slender, calloused hands of the orphan girl from the church kitchen. Levi Cartwright's grip on her elbow tightened, not in anger, but as if to keep her from collapsing. He had not just bailed a witness, he had taken custody of the town's prime suspect, and the invisible cage of circumstance snapped shut around them both. The journey to Cartwright Gulch was a silent one. Levi Cartwright handled the reins of his buckboard with an economy of motion that seemed to extend to his entire being, his gaze fixed on the rutted track that wound its way up into the foothills. Alma sat beside him, ramrod straight, the $1,000 bond a crushing weight upon her shoulders. The wind whipped strands of her dark hair across her face, cold and sharp as tiny razors. The warmth and noise of the fair already felt a world away, replaced by the vast, indifferent silence of the mountains. Cartwright Gulch was not a town. It was a place of relentless industry, carved into a narrow valley. A long row of identical log bunkhouses stood sentinel on one side of a muddy thoroughfare. Opposite them were the functional buildings of the mine, a blacksmith's forge belching black smoke, a stables, a vast ore-crushing house from which came a constant, rhythmic, bone-jarring thump, and a long, low cookhouse. The entire camp was dominated by the headframe of the main shaft, a skeletal timber beast that clawed at the pale sky, a creak, its surface already laced with a filigree of ice, snaked through the center of it all. This was Levi Cartwright's kingdom, a place of wood, iron, and stone, built for profit, not comfort. He pulled the buckboard to a halt before the largest structure, a 2-story log house that was only marginally less austere than the others. "This is the main house," he said, his first words since leaving Silver Bend. "You will work here, cook, mend. Whatever Mrs. Gable needs. In return, you will have a room, board, and my protection. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," Alma murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Protection. The word sounded foreign and fragile. Inside, the house was clean, filled with sturdy, unadorned furniture and the smell of beeswax and wood smoke. A stout woman with graying hair and a no-nonsense expression, Mrs. Gable, was given her instructions. Alma was to be treated as any other employee. She was given a small, plain room at the back of the house, with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out onto the frozen creek. It was more space and privacy than she had known in over a year. The first few days passed in a blur of work. She helped Mrs. Gable in the kitchen, peeled potatoes until her fingers were raw, darned socks for Levi's 3 young nephews, and scrubbed floors. She kept her head down and her mouth shut, acutely aware of the curious and sometimes hostile glances from the miners who came to the main house on errands. The whispers from town had followed her up the gulch on the cold wind. They called her the boss's kitchen girl, the words loaded with a crude insinuation that made her cheeks burn. Levi, for his part, was a remote presence. He left before dawn and returned long after dusk, his face etched with the weariness of a man who carried the weight of 100 men's livelihoods on his shoulders. But Alma saw things. She saw the way he treated his men, with a gruff fairness that bordered on respect. There were no bellowed curses, no casual cruelties that were so common in other camps. Wages were paid in full and on time. A man injured in the mine was cared for. His pay continued until he was back on his feet. This was not the act of a tyrant, but of a careful, pragmatic leader. One evening, he found her in his small office, a room lined with geological maps and heavy ledgers. Mrs. Gable, seeing Alma's neat handwriting, had tasked her with transcribing the day's blasting reports and payroll logs. Levi stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her pen scratch across the page. "You have a good hand for figures," he observed, stepping into the room. "Sister May taught me," Alma said, not looking up from her work. She said a woman with a head for numbers is less likely to be cheated. A ghost of a smile touched Levi's lips. "Sister May is a wise woman." He picked up a ledger, his large, calloused fingers tracing a column of figures. "From now on, this will be part of your duties. You will record the daily logs. Your pay will be adjusted accordingly." A flicker of pride, fierce and unfamiliar, ignited in Alma's chest. It was the first time she had been acknowledged for a skill, not just for the strength of her back. The ledger became her sanctuary. In its ordered columns and neat rows, there was a kind of justice, a clarity that the world outside lacked. Here, a ton of ore was a ton of ore. A day's wage was a day's wage. There were no rumors, no half-truths, only the cold, hard facts of the mine. The fragile peace of her new routine was shattered a week later. A deputy from town rode into camp, his horse kicking up flurries of the first snow. He delivered a formal notice to Levi. Sheriff Pike was threatening to revoke Cartwright and Company's operating license, citing a clause that forbade the harboring of known felons. The message was clear: get rid of the girl, or face the consequences. Alma saw Levi read the document, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He wrote a short, terse reply and handed it back to the deputy, dismissing him without another word. The next day, Barrett Sloan arrived. He rode a fine black stallion and was dressed in a tailored wool coat that looked absurdly out of place in the muddy camp. He did not dismount, but hailed Levi from the yard, his voice slick with false concern. "Cartwright," he called out. I heard about your troubles with Pike. A difficult situation. I wanted to offer my support. Perhaps some of my men could help with your security, ensure there are no more incidents. A partnership for the good of the valley. Levi walked out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked up at his rival, his face unreadable. My security is handled. Sloan, but I appreciate the offer. Think about it, Sloan said with a tight smile. It is a dangerous world. It would be a shame if your operation were to suffer because you were too proud to accept a neighbor's help. The threat hung in the cold air between them, as sharp and ugly as a hangman's noose. Alma watched from the window, her stomach twisting into a knot of fear. She was the cause of this. Her presence was a stone thrown into the placid, orderly pond of Levi's life, and the ripples were spreading, threatening to swamp him. One afternoon, as a biting wind howled down the gulch, she was trying to secure a canvas sheet over a stack of firewood. The wind tore it from her grasp, and she stumbled after it. Levi came around the corner of the house and caught the flapping canvas with one hand. As he helped her tie it down, the wind gusted again, cutting through her thin shawl. Without a word, he shrugged out of his own heavy, sheepskin-lined coat and draped it over her shoulders. The warmth of it was immediate, a startling comfort that smelled of leather, cold air, and the faint, clean scent of the soap he used. It was a gesture of pure, unthinking kindness, a shield against the cold, and it unsettled her more than any harsh word could have. "Thank you," she mumbled, pulling the collar tight under her chin. "You are no good to me if you catch a chill," he said, his tone gruff, almost dismissive, but his eyes held a different story. He turned and walked away, leaving her enveloped in the heavy warmth of his coat, feeling both protected and profoundly indebted. The next morning, she made a decision. She could not simply hide in the kitchen, a passive cause of Levi's troubles. She had to do something. She started to watch the miners, truly watch them, listening to their conversations, noting the small details of their lives. She was looking for anything out of place, any sign of who might have been in town that day, who might have a grudge, who might have a secret. It was a few days later that she saw it. A young miner named Ethan, a boy barely 20 with a perpetually worried expression, was repairing a broken strap on a mule's harness. He was using a short length of rope to bind the leather, and he tied it with a double figure-8 bend, a kiln hitch. The world seemed to lurch to a stop. Alma stared at the knot, her breath catching in her throat. It was identical to the one she had practiced, the one that had condemned her. He finished his work and coiled the leftover rope, hanging it from a nail inside the stables. Alma's mind raced. It was him. It had to be. But what did it mean? Was he one of the robbers, or had he simply provided the rope? An unwitting accomplice? To go to Levi with this would be to send the boy to the gallows. She, who knew the bitter taste of false accusation, would be the accuser. But to stay silent was to let the shadow of guilt hang over her, and by extension, over Levi. To let Sloan and Pike continue to circle, to tighten their net. Levi had risked his reputation and a fortune for her. She could not repay him with silence. Her heart hammered as she wrestled with her conscience. Fear warred with a burgeoning sense of loyalty. Finally, she knew what she had to do. She could not accuse him outright. She had to give him a chance. That evening, she found Ethan by the stables, grooming his mule. She approached him cautiously, her hands clasped in front of her. "Ethan," she said, her voice softer than she intended. He looked up, startled. "Miss Reyes, that was a fine job you did on that harness this morning," she began, her words feeling clumsy and false. "That knot you used, it is a strong one. A kiln hitch." The color drained from the young man's face. His eyes, wide and terrified, darted around the yard as if looking for an escape. I do not know what you mean," he stammered, turning his attention back to the mule, brushing its flank with frantic, jerky motions. "It is just an unusual knot to see." Alma pressed gently, her own fear making her bold. I was wondering where a person might learn to tie one like that." Ethan dropped his brush. He looked at her, his expression a mixture of panic and pleading. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just shook his head, a desperate, silent denial. Then he turned and practically fled, disappearing into the deepening twilight of the bunkhouse. Alma stood alone in the cold, a terrible certainty settling in her heart. She had done the wrong thing. She had shown her hand, and in doing so, she had cornered a frightened animal. A sense of dread followed her through a sleepless night, before the first hint of dawn colored the sky. The camp foreman was at the door of the main house, his face grim. Ethan's bunk was empty. His few meager possessions were gone. He had run. Sometime in the dead of night, the young miner had vanished into the wilderness, taking his secrets with him and leaving Alma more dangerously exposed than ever before. Ethan's flight left a vacuum in the camp, a pocket of cold silence filled with unspoken questions. To Alma, his absence was a constant, throbbing accusation. She had pushed a scared boy into the wilderness, and in doing so, had kicked the legs out from under her own fragile claim to innocence. Levi said nothing about the incident, but a new, grim watchfulness settled in his eyes. He knew, as she did, that a loose thread had been pulled, and it was only a matter of time before something unraveled. The world seemed to hold its breath for a week, and then the sky fell. The first blizzard of the season did not arrive gently. It descended upon the gulch like a conquering army, a blinding, howling wall of white that erased the world. The temperature plummeted. The constant, thunderous heartbeat of the ore-crushing machinery fell silent as the men were forced to take shelter in the bunkhouses. The wind shrieked through the gaps in the log walls, a mournful, predatory sound. By the second day, the crisis was no longer potential, but real and immediate. The supply wagon from Silver Bend was long overdue, undoubtedly trapped in a drift on the high pass. Food stocks in the cookhouse, meant to feed 100 hungry men, were dwindling at an alarming rate. Anxiety, as sharp and cold as the air itself, began to seep into the camp. It was in the midst of this growing despair that Sister May arrived, a small, black-clad figure battling her way through the storm from the small infirmary at the far end of the camp where she had been tending to a sick miner. She appeared at the main house, her wimple dusted with snow, her face chapped red by the wind, but her eyes as clear and determined as ever. "The men are getting restless, Alma," she said, unwrapping her scarf, "and a hungry miner is a dangerous creature." A spark of purpose ignited in Alma, chasing away the gnawing fear that had taken root since Ethan's departure. This was something she understood. This was a problem that could be solved with work, not with words. "The stores are low. Sister, flour, bacon, beans. We can make it last a few more days, but not if we feed them full portions." "Then we will not feed them full portions," Sister May declared, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We will make soup. A stew so thick a spoon can stand in it. We will pool everything. The main house supplies, the men's personal stashes. We will turn this kitchen into a fortress against the cold and hunger." And so they did, with Levi's quiet nod of approval. They organized the camp. Men were dispatched to the bunkhouses to gather what they could: a forgotten sack of potatoes, a string of dried peppers, a precious half-jar of molasses. The main cookhouse became the heart of the camp, a bastion of warmth and savory steam against the raging blizzard. Alma, with Sister May at her side, stood before the huge cast-iron stove, directing the chaotic but good-natured efforts of a half-dozen miners-turned-kitchen helpers. For 3 days, she worked tirelessly, ladling out hot, thick soup that warmed the belly and fortified the spirit. She moved with a calm efficiency that belied the storm both outside and within her own heart. She saw a young miner, new to the territory, stumbling in from a desperate attempt to check on the mules, his face ashen, his fingers a waxy, corpse-like white. Without hesitation, she guided him to the fire, gently submerging his frozen hands in a bucket of lukewarm water, ignoring his pained cries as the feeling began to return. Harlan Maddox, the camp's one-eyed doctor, a man whose humor was as dry as the dust in his medical bag, watched her work. He had been a constant presence, moving between the bunkhouses, treating coughs and minor injuries. He came into the cookhouse, shaking snow from his hat, and accepted a steaming mug of soup from Alma. He took a sip, his one good eye twinkling. "Well, I will be. This soup of yours is warmer than the whiskey Nellie Hart sells, and twice as likely to save a man's life." The miners within earshot laughed, a rough, grateful sound. Alma felt a blush rise to her cheeks, but she also felt a sliver of pride. Here, in this kitchen. She was not the accused, not the boss's charity case. She was the woman with the soup, a provider of warmth and life. From the doorway, Levi watched the scene, his face in shadow. He saw her steady hands, her calm command of the kitchen, her quiet compassion. He saw a resilience he had not expected, a strength that had nothing to do with physical size and everything to do with spirit. And for the first time, he allowed himself to think that his $5,000 wager had been a sound investment. On the third night of the storm, the wind finally began to lose its fury, settling into a deep, exhausted moan. The camp was quiet, the men asleep in their bunks with full bellies. Alma, too tired to sleep, sat in the dark kitchen of the main house, staring out her small window at the transformed landscape. The world was a sea of white under a sky thick with stars, the cold air so clear it felt brittle. It was then that she saw it, a flicker of light, high on the opposing slope, in the direction of Barrett Sloane's North Star mine. It was a lantern, she realized, and it was not steady. It flashed once, then twice, then went dark. A pause, then it flashed again. Once, then twice. It was a signal. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, washed over her. The pattern was identical to the one she had seen in her mind's eye 1,000 times. The signal that Sheriff Pike had accused her of giving on the day of the robbery. She did not think. She acted. Throwing a heavy cloak over her shoulders, she ran from the kitchen and burst into Levi's office, where a single lamp still burned. He was hunched over a map, a pen in his hand. He looked up, his expression hardening at the sight of her wild-eyed panic. "A light," she gasped, her breath clouding in the cold air of the room. On the North Star slope, it was a signal, the same signal. He was on his feet in an instant, his fatigue vanishing. "Are you certain?" "Yes, I saw it, twice." He grabbed his heavy coat from a peg on the wall and pulled on his boots. He did not question her, did not doubt her. He simply trusted her. "Show me." They moved out into the silent, frozen world, their boots crunching on the fresh snow. The air was so cold it burned the lungs. He carried a rifle and a lantern, its light casting long, dancing shadows. She led him around the back of the house, to the spot by the creek where the view of the opposite ridge was clearest. They stood in the biting cold for 10 minutes that felt like an eternity, their eyes scanning the dark, snow-covered mountainside. Then it came again. Flash, flash, a pause. Flash, flash, unmistakable. "There is a line cabin up there," Levi said, his voice a low growl. "Sloane uses it for storage." Without another word, they began to move, following the line of the frozen creek, using the deep shadows of the valley walls for cover. It was treacherous going. The snow was deep in places, and patches of slick ice lay hidden beneath the white blanket. After nearly an hour of hard, silent trekking, they found what they were looking for. Not footprints, but the tracks of a small sleigh, the runners cutting a clear path in the snow, leading away from the North Star camp and up toward the storage cabin. The cabin was little more than a crude log box, half hidden in a thick stand of pine. A faint light shone from between the chinks in the logs. Levi extinguished their lantern. They crept closer. The only sound, the whisper of the wind through the pine needles and the frantic beating of Alma's heart. They could hear muffled voices from inside. They waited. After a few minutes, the cabin door opened, and 2 men emerged. They did not linger, but immediately climbed onto the sleigh and headed back down the slope toward Sloane's mine. Levi and Alma waited until the sound of the sleigh bells had faded completely. Then, with his rifle held at the ready, Levi moved to the cabin door. It was secured with a heavy, new-looking padlock. With a grunt of effort, he used the butt of his rifle to smash the lock. The sound was like a gunshot in the profound silence. He pushed the door open and raised his lantern. The small cabin was stacked to the rafters with canvas ore sacks. Alma's heart sank. It was just ore. There was nothing here. "Wait," Levi said, his voice tight. He stepped inside and picked up one of the sacks, testing its weight. He set it down and picked up another from a different stack. His brow furrowed. He pulled his knife from his belt and slit the side of the first sack. A cascade of dull, gray, silver-flecked quartz spilled onto the dirt floor. Then he slit the second sack. What poured out was different. It was still mixed with quartz, but among the worthless rock were chunks of ore so richly laced with veins of pure, gleaming gold that it seemed to absorb the lantern light and glow with a life of its own. It was the high-grade ore from the heart of the Cartwright mine. Alma knelt and picked up a piece, and then she saw it, stamped into the side of the raw gold, a mark made by the specialized head of the Cartwright Company's pneumatic drills. Was a tiny, distinctive symbol, a hammer inside a circle. It was Levi's mark, as unique as his signature. "He is stealing your ore," she breathed, a mixture of triumph and terror churning inside her. "He is smuggling it out, a little at a time." "More than that," Levi said, his voice grim as he pointed the lantern toward the back of the cabin. Stacked there were 3 small, heavy wooden crates. He pried one open with the tip of his knife. It was filled with gold ingots, each one bearing the same hammer in a circle stamp. It was the gold from the robbery. They had found it, the proof. But as they stood there in the cold, dusty cabin, the triumphant elation quickly curdled into a harsh reality. "We cannot go to the sheriff," Alma said, the words tasting like ash. "Pike is his man." He would impound the gold as evidence and it would disappear. Levi agreed. Then he would arrest us for breaking into Sloane's cabin and planting it. They were trapped. They had the truth in their hands, but the law was a weapon that would be used against them. Frustration, cold and bitter, settled over Alma. They returned to the main house before dawn, the knowledge of what they had found sitting between them, heavy and dangerous. Levi did not sleep. He sat in his office, staring at the geological map of the valley, the lamp casting his face in sharp relief, all harsh angles and deep shadows. Alma brought him a cup of coffee. He seemed not to notice. She watched him, saw the intense concentration in his eyes. He was not a man defeated. He was a man calculating, planning. Finally, just as the first gray light of dawn began to seep into the room, he spoke. "We cannot fight him with the law, because he owns the law. We cannot fight him with guns, because that is the fight he wants. And he will win it." He tapped a long finger on the map, tracing the blue line of the creek that ran through the gulch, the same creek that flowed down past the base of the ridge where Sloane's storage cabins sat. "So we will fight him with this," Levi said, a strange, fierce light in his eyes. "We will fight him with dirt and water." He unrolled another schematic, a survey map showing elevations and water tables. "The creek bed makes a sharp turn here, on my property, but the geology shows the old channel from 100 years ago. Ran straight. The ground is softer there. If we dig a diversion trench, right here, we can change the course of the creek." Alma looked at him, confused. "Why, Sloane is using that cabin as a transfer point. My guess is he uses the quiet of the night to move the stolen gold and ore down the back slope to the creek bed, where a wagon can pick it up without ever coming near the main road. If we divert the creek..." He traced a new line with his finger. The new channel would cut right across the hidden path from the cabin. It would turn the secret route into a muddy, impassable swamp. We cut him off. We stop his transport. It is on my land. It is perfectly legal, and he will not see it coming. Alma looked from the map to Levi's face. She saw not just a miner, but a strategist, a general planning a campaign where the battlefield was the earth itself. And in that moment, she made a choice. She was no longer a victim, a piece of flotsam tossed about by the currents of other men's greed. She was a participant. She pointed to a section of the map. "The ground is shale here," she said, remembering the notations from the blasting logs she had been transcribing. "It will be unstable when the water hits it. You will need to shore it up with timber, or you will have a landslide." Levi looked at her, a flicker of genuine surprise in his eyes, followed by a slow nod of respect. "You are right," he said. He handed her the pen. "Show me." And as the first rays of the sun streamed through the window, they bent over the map together, no longer a boss and his kitchen girl, but partners. The creek was about to change its course, and so was Alma's life. The work of moving a creek was a brutal, muddy affair. For days, the gulch echoed not with the familiar crash of the ore stampers, but with the rhythmic scrape and thud of shovels against rocky soil and the curses of men fighting a frozen, stubborn earth. Levi was in his element, moving among his crews, his voice never rising above a low command, his own hands as caked with mud as any of his laborers. He was a general waging a war of topography, and his quiet intensity was infectious. Alma, too, had found her place in the battle. She was no longer just a kitchen girl. She was the keeper of the maps, the clerk who cross-referenced blasting reports with survey charts, ensuring the men were digging in the right place, that the timber supports were placed where the shale was weakest. She ran the cookhouse with military precision, keeping a constant supply of hot coffee and thick stew flowing to the exhausted men, fuel for their monumental task. It was this scene of organized, muddy chaos that Nellie Hart rode into one afternoon. The saloon owner handled her mare with an easy grace, her practical riding skirt a stark contrast to her usual silken dresses. She waved away a cup of coffee and waited for Levi to approach, her expression unusually serious. "You are making a lot of noise up here, Levi," she said, her gaze sweeping over the long, deep trench that was slowly scarring the valley floor. "The creek decided it wanted a new bed," Levi replied, his tone flat. Nellie gave a short, mirthless laugh. "The creek, right. I am not here about your landscaping, and you know it. I am here about the girl." She nodded toward the cookhouse, where Alma could be seen directing the unloading of a sack of flour. "The talk in town is getting ugly. They have stopped whispering and started talking right out loud. They say you are keeping a mistress, a half-breed murderess, right under the noses of your sister's boys. They say you paid $5,000 for her because she is worth that much to you in the dark." Levi's face was stone, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "Let them talk." "It is not just talk anymore," Nellie pressed, her voice lowering. "Barrett Sloan is buying rounds for anyone with a filthy story to tell, and Sheriff Pike is listening. They are poisoning the well. Levi, you know how this works. Once the whole town decides she is a whore, it will not matter what the truth is. They will tear her apart with their eyes, and they will tear you down for protecting her." The warning, delivered with the blunt pragmatism of a friend, hung in the frigid air long after Nellie had ridden away. The mud and rock seemed easier to fight than the viscous, unseen poison of gossip. 2 days later, the poison arrived in an official capacity. Sheriff Pike rode into the gulch, not with a posse, but with a single, smirking deputy. He did not bluster or shout. He dismounted, brushed the dust from his vest, and presented Levi with a folded document with an air of triumphant bureaucracy. "Morning. Cartwright," he said, his smile all teeth. "Just doing my civic duty. The town council, concerned about vagrancy and public morals, passed a new residency ordinance last night. All persons residing within the township's limits not on their own deeded land, must be formally registered with my office as a dependent, a ward, or a direct employee with a verifiable contract. He let the words sink in. Alma, who had come out onto the porch of the main house, felt a familiar cold dread seep into her bones. The ordinance was a weapon, crafted with a lawyer's precision and aimed directly at her. "She works for me," Levi said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Does she now?" Pike said with a theatrical show of surprise. "I have heard other things, but I am a man of the law. You have 24 hours to produce a formal contract of employment filed with the county clerk, or she will be considered a vagrant, and we will escort her out of the county, for her own safety. Of course." He tipped his hat, the gesture a mockery of respect, and rode away, leaving the ultimatum to fester in the quiet camp. The trap was elegant in its cruelty. To register her as a ward would be to publicly declare her a helpless charity case, confirming the whispers. To forge a contract would be a crime. He had left Levi with no honorable way out. He would have to choose lose the girl, or lose his standing by openly defying the law. That night, a tense silence filled the main house. Levi's 3 young nephews, usually a boisterous storm of activity, seemed to sense the oppressive weight in the air and were unusually subdued. Alma could not eat. Every mouthful felt like a betrayal of the man who was risking everything to shelter her. She was a blight, a disease that would slowly consume all he had built. After the boys were in bed, she found Levi in his office, staring not at his maps, but into the cold, black square of the window. "You should send me away," she said, her voice barely audible. "Before they ruin you." Levi turned from the window. His face was a mask of weariness, but his eyes were clear. "They do not get to decide who stays in my camp. Alma, I do." The next morning, he rode out early, heading not to the diversion trench, but toward Silver Bend. He offered no explanation. Alma watched him go, a knot of despair tightening in her chest. She was certain he was going to make a deal, to find some way to send her away that would cause the least damage to himself. The Golden Slipper Saloon was crowded for a weekday morning, a testament to the number of idle hands Barrett Sloane's free whiskey had created. When Levi Cartwright pushed through the bat-wing doors, the low hum of conversation faltered and died. Men turned on their stools, their eyes wary. Levi ignored them. He walked directly to the large, cluttered notice board at the back of the room, a place where claims, auction notices, and wanted posters were tacked up for all to see. From his coat, he produced a document and a small tack hammer. With 4 clean, decisive strikes, he nailed the paper to the board. He did not speak a word. He simply turned and walked out, the doors swinging shut behind him, leaving a room full of stunned, curious men. A slow shuffle became a rush as the saloon's patrons crowded around the notice board. What they saw was not a surrender or a plea. It was a formal, legally witnessed contract of employment from the Cartwright and Company mining concern. It listed the employee, one Alma Reyes. It detailed her duties, camp clerk and supervisor of the main house kitchen, and at the bottom, in clear, bold ink, was her remuneration a weekly wage of $4.50, plus room and board. It was a simple, irrefutable fact, a business transaction. Levi had not engaged in the argument. He had rendered it irrelevant. He had taken the whispers of the back alley and answered them in the public language of commerce. A woman who earned a wage like that was not a mistress or a charity case. She was a worker. The murmuring in the saloon started again, but its tone had changed. It was no longer salacious, but grudgingly respectful. The legal trap had been disarmed with a piece of paper and a hammer. That evening, for the first time in a week, the atmosphere in the main house was lighter. The work on the creek was nearly finished, and Levi's public defiance in town had sent a clear message. For dinner, Alma had made a rich beef stew, and the small family of circumstance led by his nephews, and Alma was joined by Dr. Maddox. The doctor, rubbing his rheumatic knee, looked at Alma with his good eye. "If you were a witch, Miss Reyes, I would ask you to put a charm on this blasted joint of mine." Alma, clearing the plates, allowed herself a small, tired smile. Less of Nellie's whiskey would do the trick faster than any charm, Doctor. Levi let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound so rare it made his youngest nephew look up in surprise. In that moment, sitting around the warm table, a fragile sense of belonging began to take root in Alma's heart. They were a strange, patched-together family, bound not by blood, but by shared work and a quiet, unspoken loyalty. The feeling was shattered by a shout from the darkness outside, followed by the terrifying cry of fire. Levi was on his feet before the word had finished echoing. Alma ran to the window and saw it, a horrifyingly beautiful pillar of orange and red flame roaring into the night sky. The lumber shed, filled with the dry, seasoned timber needed for the mine shafts, was completely engulfed. The camp exploded into a chaos of shouting men and frantic activity, but above the roar of the fire and the panic, there was no organizing force, no alarm. Alma did not hesitate. She ran out onto the porch, to the large iron triangle that served as the camp's dinner bell. She grabbed the metal striker and began to beat it with all her strength. A frantic, desperate clang, clang, clang that cut through the noise. A clarion call to order in the midst of madness. It was her voice, a shout of iron that would not be ignored. Men, drawn by the sound, began to form a bucket brigade from the creek. Levi was at their head, his face a grim, soot-streaked mask in the firelight, yelling orders. The heat was immense, a physical blow that drove them back. The fire was already licking at the corner of the stables next door, and the terrified whinnies of the horses inside added a new, horrifying note to the din. "Abe's in there," a miner screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the lumber shed. He was taking a nap in the back room. A collective groan of horror went through the men. The front of the shed was an impassable wall of flame. Levi grabbed a horse blanket from a nearby rail and plunged it into a water trough. He was going in. The back window, Alma shouted to him over the roar, "It is on the far side, I saw it this morning." He met her eyes for a split second, a look of understanding passing between them. He ran toward the back of the building, and she was right beside him, soaking another blanket for herself. He smashed the small window with a rock. A wave of black, choking smoke billowed out. Levi threw the wet blanket over his head and was about to heave himself through the opening when Alma pushed the second soaked blanket into his hands. "For Abe," she yelled. He gave a sharp nod, then disappeared into the inferno. Seconds later, Alma, her own face covered by a wet cloth, scrambled in after him. Inside was a disorienting, suffocating hell. The heat was beyond anything she had ever experienced, and the smoke was a blinding, acrid fog. They found the young miner, Abe, on the floor, dazed and coughing, as they each took an arm and began to drag him toward the window. A burning crossbeam overhead groaned and then collapsed, showering them in a cascade of sparks and embers. A dozen of the fiery cinders landed on Alma's arm, her thin dress offering no protection. She cried out in sharp, searing pain, but she did not let go of the man. Together, she and Levi managed to push the groggy miner through the window into the waiting arms of his friends. As Levi helped Alma scramble out after him, the entire roof of the shed gave way with a deafening roar, sending a fountain of fire and sparks into the dark sky. Later, when the fire had been beaten back to a smoldering, hissing ruin, Dr. Maddox was in the main house kitchen, tending to Alma's arm. He carefully cleaned the angry red welts on her wrist and forearm, applying a soothing salve before wrapping it in clean white bandages. "You were a fool to go in there," he said gruffly, but his touch was gentle and a brave one. Levi stood in the doorway, silent, watching the entire procedure. His face was black with soot, his clothes were singed, but his eyes were fixed on Alma. When the doctor was finished, Levi crossed the room. He did not ask if she was in pain. He did not offer words of thanks. He simply reached out and took her bandaged wrist, his large, rough hand cradling it with an astonishing gentleness. He looked down at the white bandage that covered the burn. Then he raised his gaze to meet hers. There was no pity in his eyes. There was something else, something deeper. It was a look of profound, almost reverent respect. He was not looking at a wound. He was looking at a scar, a mark of courage, a testament to a spirit that refused to break. And in the quiet kitchen, amidst the lingering smell of smoke, that silent, shared look forged a bond far stronger than any contract, a bond sealed in the heart of the fire. The night after the fire was a night of profound and watchful silence. The raw, red glow of the embers had died down, leaving a blackened, skeletal scar where the lumber shed had stood. The wind, which had fanned the flames with such a malevolent fury, had softened to a dry, mournful whisper that carried the lingering scent of wet ash and burnt pine. The entire camp seemed to be holding its breath, exhausted by the violence of the blaze and the adrenaline of the fight. Alma sat on the top step of the main house porch, a thick woolen blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The deep, throbbing ache in her arm was a constant, pulsing reminder of the heat and the chaos. Sleep was an impossibility. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the terrifying orange of the flames, felt the choking thickness of the smoke. The front door opened and closed softly. Levi Cartwright came out and sat on the step beside her, not close enough to touch, but near enough that she could feel the quiet solidity of his presence in the vast, starry darkness. He held 2 tin mugs, and the steam that rose from them carried the rich, bracing aroma of coffee. He handed one to her, and their fingers brushed for a moment. His skin was rough with calluses, yet his touch was careful. They drank in silence for a long time, watching the star-dusted arc of the sky. The mountains were immense, black shapes against the deeper black of the night, their familiar presence a comfort. In the gulch, there was only the sound of the wind and the gentle murmur of the creek, now flowing contentedly in its new, man-made channel. Finally, the tight wrapping on her arm felt unbearable, a constriction on the searing pain, with her good hand. Alma fumbled with the knot Dr. Maddox had tied and slowly, carefully, began to unwind the bandage. The cool night air on her skin was a small relief. She looked at the burn. It was an ugly map of blisters and angry red flesh, a stark, violent mark against the olive tone of her skin. It was a brand, she thought, another scar to mark her as an outsider. Levi watched her, his expression unreadable in the dim starlight. He saw the faint lines of exhaustion etched around her eyes, the way the fire had dried her dark hair, leaving it brittle and streaked with fine gray ash. He saw the new, hard-earned lines of weariness on a face that was already too familiar with hardship. He had seen her at the town fair, a pretty but half-starved girl with defiance in her eyes. He saw her now, a woman who had walked through fire, literally and figuratively, and had not been consumed. The fine, delicate beauty of her youth was being weathered away by the harsh Montana elements, replaced by something harder, more enduring. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze still on her face. His voice, when he finally spoke, was so quiet it was almost part of the wind's whisper. Her beauty faded with time, but to me, she was still the prettiest girl in town. The words were so unexpected, so strange, that Alma thought for a moment she had imagined them. She turned to look at him, a question in her eyes. The sincerity on his face was absolute, disarming. A short, startled laugh escaped her lips, a dry, rusty sound. Silver Bend must be short on pretty girls, then. It was the kind of deflection she had used her whole life, a small shield of wit to ward off anything that felt too much like kindness or pity. Levi shook his head slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. A long moment passed between them, a silence stretched taut with unspoken things. "No," he said, his voice low and certain. "I just see more clearly now." He set his mug down on the wooden step and, without a word, shrugged off the heavy coat he wore. He leaned over and draped it gently over her shoulders, pulling the collar up around her neck. The thick wool was still warm from his body, and it enveloped her in a cocoon of surprising comfort. The gesture was so much more than a defense against the cold. It was an offering, an acknowledgement, an embrace without touch. The shields she had carried for so long suddenly felt impossibly heavy. The witty retort died on her lips. She could feel the warmth of his breath in the small space between them. He did not move away. He leaned in, just an inch, and rested his forehead against hers. It was not a kiss. It was a quieter, more profound connection. The light, firm pressure of his touch was an anchor in the swirling confusion of her emotions. They stayed like that for a timeless moment, two solitary people sharing their warmth and their weariness under a canopy of a million distant stars. When he finally pulled back, the space he left felt cold. He picked up his coffee mug again, his movements once more deliberate and contained. But something fundamental had shifted between them. The wall of respectful distance he had so carefully maintained around himself had been breached. "I was married once," he said, his eyes fixed on the dark outline of the far ridge. The words were simple, factual, yet they landed with the weight of a great stone. Her name was Eleanor. She was from back east, a city girl. She thought this country was a grand adventure, a storybook full of cowboys and gold. He fell silent, and Alma knew not to speak, to simply listen to the story he was finally allowing himself to tell. She hated it here, he continued, his voice flat, devoid of self-pity. She hated the dust and the cold and the silence. She was like a bright canary in a cage made of rough-sawn pine. The marriage was brief. A year later, the fever came through the camps. It took her in 3 days. It also took our son. He was 6 months old. Alma closed her eyes, a sharp, empathetic pain lancing through her. The remote, powerful owner of the Cartwright mine was suddenly a man who had known a grief so profound it had hollowed him out, leaving this quiet, guarded shell behind. His solitary life, his devotion to his orphan nephews, his fierce protection of what was his, it all snapped into focus. "I am sorry," she whispered. The words felt small and utterly inadequate. He gave a slight, dismissive shake of his head. "It was a long time ago. I learned a lesson. This land does not care for fragile things. So I closed the door. I decided it was better to build with rock and timber than with hope. It is safer." He turned to look at her then, and in his eyes, she saw the ghost of that long-ago pain, and something new, a flicker of fear. He had opened the door for her, just a crack, and it terrified him. The honesty of his confession demanded one of her own. She looked down at her hands, one bandaged, the other clenched tight in her lap. "I am afraid," she admitted, the words tasting strange and rusty in her mouth. "All this time, I have been afraid that I am just a season in this place for you, a problem to be managed, that once the trouble with Sloane is done, and my name is cleared, I will be a loose end, a wind that passes through." She finally voiced the deepest fear of an orphan who had never truly belonged anywhere, the fear that every kindness was temporary, every shelter conditional. Levi listened, his expression intent. When she was finished, he reached out and gently touched her bandaged wrist, his fingers resting just above the burn. "Then I will build a roof for that wind," he said, his voice a low, steady promise. Her breath caught in her throat. He was not offering pity or a temporary haven. He was offering permanence. He was offering a home. The word itself was so foreign, so filled with a painful, hopeful longing, that it brought tears to her eyes. She blinked them back fiercely, refusing to cry. A new resolve settled between them in the quiet of the night. They were no longer just a man and the woman he was protecting. They were partners, allies. Hiding was no longer an option. "The fire," Alma said, her voice stronger now, clearer. "It was not an accident. It was Sloane." I know, Levi replied. It was a message, a warning to back off. He knows we are getting close. He is getting desperate. The diverted creek must have worked. Then, she reasoned, it must have stopped him from moving the gold. Now he is trapped, with a cabin full of stolen ore and no way to move it. And a man like Sloane, when he is trapped, he does not surrender. He gets more dangerous, Levi finished. He stood up, pacing the length of the porch once, his mind clearly working. We have the proof, the marked ingots, the high-grade ore, but it is still our word against his, and Pike still holds the law in his pocket. He stopped in front of her, his silhouette stark against the starlight. We cannot wait for him to make the next move. We have to force his hand. We have to bring the truth out into the open, in a place where Pike cannot bury it. A plan began to form in the space between them. A strategy born of shared danger and a new, unspoken trust. The town's annual Founders' Day celebration, the Spring Mining Festival, was in 2 weeks. It was a public event, a day when the territorial assayers came to weigh and certify the major mines' quarterly yields. It was a day of public record. The festival, Alma said, the idea taking shape in her own mind. The public assay. If you were to bring in an ore sample for certification, a sample taken from Sloane's cabin. Levi's eyes lit with a grim understanding. We present the evidence in front of the entire town, and the territorial officials. We make it impossible for Pike to ignore. We show them the hammer mark, and we show them the map of my new creek, right where his transport route used to be. It was a bold, dangerous gamble. It would mean a public confrontation, a high-stakes game of truth and lies played out on the main street of Silver Bend. But as they stood there on the porch, the smell of ash still tainting the air, they both knew it was the only way. They had been reacting, defending, hiding. Now, they would attack. They would take the fight to Sloane and Pike, armed not with guns, but with a map, a piece of rock, and the undeniable truth. The fear was still there, a cold knot in Alma's stomach, but for the first time, it was mingled with a fierce, burning hope. She pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders, the promise of its warmth a shield against the cold night and the uncertain days ahead. The day of the Spring Mining Festival dawned bright and deceptively peaceful. A nervous energy hummed through Silver Bend, a palpable excitement that had nothing to do with the judging of prize livestock or the quality of the preserves on display. This was a day of reckoning, a day when fortunes were measured and reputations were made or broken. The main street was thronged with miners in their cleanest shirts, ranchers from the outlying valleys, and the sober-suited territorial officials who had set up their scales and ledgers on a long trestle table in front of the assay office. Barrett Sloane was in his element, holding court near the Golden Slipper Saloon, accepting congratulations on a recent rich strike as if it were his due. Sheriff Pike stood nearby, a smug, proprietary air about him, his presence a clear sign of whose side the law favored. They were the kings of the town, secure in their power. Alma stood with her own small, unlikely army near the church. Sister May was a pillar of calm in her severe black habit. Dr. Maddox leaned on his cane, his one good eye missing nothing, a cynical but steady presence. And Nellie Hart, dressed in a surprisingly demure navy blue dress, looked for all the world like a respectable businesswoman, though her eyes held the hard-won wisdom of the saloon floor. Alma's hand strayed unconsciously to the faint, silvery lines of the scar on her wrist, a reminder of the fire that had forged her resolve. She was terrified, a cold, hard knot of fear in her stomach, but she stood tall, her gaze fixed on the trestle table where the fate of the town would be decided. A path cleared in the crowd as the Cartwright wagon appeared. It was not the usual heavy gold transport, but a simple buckboard carrying several canvas ore sacks. Levi Cartwright sat at the reins, his face set like granite. He pulled the wagon to a halt before the officials and dismounted. He did not look at Sloane or Pike. His attention was focused entirely on the head assayer. I have a sample I wish to submit for public certification, Levi announced, his voice carrying clearly in the expectant hush. He hefted one of the sacks and placed it on the table. With a slash of his knife, he opened it, spilling a pile of quartz richly veined with gold onto the rough wood. From the North Star claim. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Barrett Sloane's smile froze on his face. He took a half step forward, his eyes narrowing. That is a lie. Cartwright, that ore is not from my mine. Is it not? Levi said calmly. He picked up a piece of the ore and handed it to the assayer. Then you will not mind if the official record notes the presence of my company's drill mark on it. The hammer in the circle, it is right there. The assayer squinted at the piece of gold, turning it over in the bright morning sun. He nodded slowly. The mark is there. Sloane's face flushed a dangerous, mottled red. He planted it. This is some kind of trick. A trick, Levi's voice remained even, but it held a new, hard edge. Perhaps you can explain why this ore, bearing my mark, was found in your storage cabin on the back slope, along with these. He untied another sack, and this time, a dozen gold ingots, each stamped with the same hammer in a circle, tumbled onto the table with a series of heavy, definitive thuds. They were the ingots from the robbery. The crowd erupted in a roar of speculation. Sheriff Pike pushed his way forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. This is a baseless accusation. You have no proof where you got that gold. Cartwright. On the contrary, Sheriff, Levi said, turning to the crowd, we have a map. He looked directly at Alma. This was her moment. Her heart hammered against her ribs. But she took a deep breath and stepped forward. Leaving the protective circle of her friends, she held a large, rolled-up piece of canvas. Her hands trembled, but she unrolled it and, with Nellie Hart's help, held it up for all to see. It was a detailed drawing of the valley, showing the Cartwright and North Star claims, the creek in its original bed, and the new, bold line of the diversion trench. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but carried an unshakable conviction. Mr. Sloane was using a hidden path along the creek bed to transport the stolen gold from his cabin. She explained, her finger tracing the route on the map. So, we moved the creek, this new channel, on Mr. Cartwright's land, flooded the path. It cut off his escape. The fire at our lumber shed happened 2 nights later. It was not an accident. It was a message to stop. The simplicity and sheer audacity of the plan held the crowd in thrall. It was a miner's logic. A brilliant piece of engineering turned into a weapon of justice. They understood maps and water rights and the unyielding logic of the land. Pike's face was a mask of fury. This is a fabrication, a ridiculous story cooked up by a thieving half-breed and her keeper. I should have locked you up when I had the chance. He lunged toward Alma, his hand outstretched as if to grab her. But a figure stepped out from the crowd, blocking his path. A young man, thin and ragged from weeks in the wilderness, his face a mixture of terror and determination. It was Ethan. "She is telling the truth," he said, his voice cracking but loud enough for everyone to hear. He looked at the stunned faces of the townspeople, the people he had grown up with. "They made me do it. Sheriff Pike and Mr. Sloane." He pointed a trembling finger at the 2 men. "They knew my father owed Mr. Sloane money. They threatened to throw him in jail, to take our claim. They forced me to watch the Cartwright camp, to report on everything. They gave me the rope with a special knot to plant at the robbery, to make it look like Miss Reyes was involved. I never wanted to. I was just scared." The confession landed like a physical blow. The final piece of the puzzle slotted into place, and the picture it revealed was ugly and undeniable. Barrett Sloane's face went pale, the face of a man who saw the gallows being built in front of him. Sheriff Pike, however, was a cornered rat, and he chose to fight. "Arrest them," he bellowed, drawing his pistol and pointing it at Ethan and Alma. "Arrest them all for conspiracy and bearing false witness." But before his deputy could move, a new sound cut through the tension. The rhythmic, steady beat of shod horses approaching at a canter. 4 riders appeared at the end of the street, their horses moving with a disciplined precision that was utterly alien to the usual chaotic traffic of Silver Bend. They were dressed in plain, functional clothes, but they wore badges that glinted in the sun, and they carried repeating rifles in their saddle scabbards. They were United States Marshals. The lead marshal, a tall man with a weathered face and cold, intelligent eyes, reined in his horse. "Sheriff Pike," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. "We are here in response to a letter sent to the Territorial Governor's office regarding allegations of mail fraud, conspiracy, and theft of federally registered gold shipments." He held up a piece of paper, a letter which included a very detailed and convincing map. He nodded his head respectfully toward Alma. The last of Sloane's composure shattered. The law, the real law, had arrived. With a desperate cry of rage, he drew his own pistol. He was not aiming at the marshals, he was aiming at Levi. Chaos erupted. A woman screamed. The crowd surged backwards. A human wave of panic. Sloane fired. The shot deafeningly loud in the square. Levi dove to the side as the bullet whizzed past his head. In that instant of pandemonium, Alma did not run away from the danger. She ran toward the church. Her mind was a point of absolute clarity. She grabbed the thick, dusty bell rope hanging in the narthex and pulled with all her strength. The great iron bell, which had marked births and deaths and Sunday services, now rang out with a frantic, urgent clangor, a sound of pure alarm. It was the voice of the town itself, shouting that something was terribly wrong. The sudden, deafening noise spooked the horses tied to the hitching posts. They reared and pulled against their tethers, their terrified whinnies adding to the din. A thick plume of black smoke from the blacksmith's forge, caught by a sudden gust of wind, rolled across the square, momentarily obscuring everything in a gray, acrid fog. It was the opening Levi needed. Through the swirling dust and smoke, he launched himself at Sloane. The two men crashed to the ground in a desperate, brutal struggle for the gun. They rolled in the dirt, grunting with effort, their feud reduced to a primitive, physical battle. Another shot rang out, this one muffled. Ethan cried out and stumbled, clutching his arm, a dark stain spreading on his sleeve. Before Sloane could fire again, Levi smashed his fist into the man's jaw. Sloane's head snapped back, and his grip on the pistol loosened. Levi wrenched it from his hand and threw it skidding into the dust. The chaos subsided as quickly as it had begun. The marshals had dismounted, their rifles now in their hands. One of them kicked Sloane's pistol away and hauled the dazed mine owner to his feet, twisting his arms behind his back. Another marshal walked calmly up to Sheriff Pike, who stood frozen, his own gun hanging uselessly at his side. The marshal plucked it from his hand and, with a grim finality, snapped a pair of iron handcuffs onto the sheriff's wrists. The dust began to settle. The church bell fell silent, its echoes still vibrating in the air. Dr. Maddox was already at Ethan's side, cutting away his sleeve to examine the bloody but superficial wound. The townspeople slowly emerged from their hiding places, their faces a mixture of fear and awe. In the middle of the street stood Levi Cartwright, breathing heavily, his knuckles bleeding, but his eyes clear and victorious. The marshals had their prisoners. The reign of Sloane and Pike was over, and standing in the doorway of the church, her hand still resting on the rope that had sounded the alarm, was Alma Reyes. She was no longer a shadow, no longer a victim. In the eyes of the entire town, she was the woman whose quiet courage and steady hand had brought the truth into the light. The departure of the United States Marshals was as quiet and efficient as their arrival. They left Silver Bend with its two most powerful men, Barrett Sloane and Sheriff Pike, bound in chains in the back of a prison wagon. The townsfolk watched them go, a silent, collective witness to the end of an era of fear. As the wagon disappeared in a cloud of red dust, a long, slow breath seemed to pass through the crowd, a release of tension that had been held for years. The air itself felt lighter, cleaner. Men and women who had previously averted their gazes now looked at each other, and at Alma, with a newfound openness. The shadow had lifted. In the days that followed, an awkward but genuine current of respect began to flow toward Alma. Miners who had once sneered at the kitchen girl now tipped their hats. Women who had whispered behind their hands now offered a quiet nod in the street. They had all seen her stand before them, armed with a map and the truth. They had heard her ring the bell. She had become, in the town's unwritten ledger, a person of substance. This new status brought with it a new set of expectations. It was simply assumed by everyone, from the merchants on Main Street to the laborers in the mines, that she would now assume the role of Mrs. Levi Cartwright. She would become the lady of the big house in the gulch, a silent partner to the town's undisputed Tycoon, her days filled with overseeing household matters and wearing fine dresses ordered from back east. It was an assumption that Levi himself seemed to share. A week after the confrontation, he found her in his office. The account ledgers spread before her, the paperwork of the mine. Once a foreign language, was now as familiar to her as a recipe for stew. She had balanced the books, accounted for the costs of the fire, and was now drafting a proposal for a new, safer system for storing blasting powder. Levi stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment, a rare, soft expression on his face. "You do not have to do that anymore. You know," he said gently. "Mrs. Gable can handle the household accounts. I can hire a full-time clerk." Alma looked up from her work, a smudge of ink on her cheek. "And what would I do?" "Whatever you wished," he said, stepping into the room. "We could expand the house, add a proper garden. You would not have to work again." He was offering her a life of ease, a gilded cage to replace the iron one she had escaped. It was the dream of every poor girl in the territory, a dream of security and comfort, offered by a good and powerful man. She looked from his earnest face to the neat columns of figures in the ledger. She thought of the miners, their faces grim with exhaustion at the end of a long shift. She thought of their wives, their knuckles raw from scrubbing, their eyes filled with the constant, low-grade fear of a cave-in or a fever. She thought of the children, their futures as uncertain as the next seam of gold, and she knew she could not accept his offer. "I cannot," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "That is not who I am. That is not the woman you saved." A flicker of confusion, and perhaps disappointment, crossed his face. "Then what is it you want, Alma?" She took a deep breath. This was her own declaration, her own map for the future. "I want to build something. Not just a bigger house for us, but a better camp for them." She gestured with her pen toward the window, toward the bunkhouses and the head frame. "The men need a proper mess hall, a place to get out of the damp and the cold. Not just a drafty cookhouse. We should have a cooling room for the summer months, with clean water to stop the heat sickness, and they need more than strong backs. We should offer reading and writing classes in the evenings. A man who can read a contract is a man who cannot be cheated." She paused, her passion for the ideas making her bold. "And the women, the widows, when a man dies in that hole," she said, her voice dropping, thick with the memory of her own father. "His family is left with nothing. We should start a fund, a small portion of the profits from every ton of ore, set aside for the widows and children of the men who die in your service. It is not charity, Levi. It is a debt." He listened to her, his head cocked, his expression shifting from surprise to a deep, thoughtful consideration. He had seen her courage, her resilience. Now he was seeing her vision. He was seeing the mind of a leader, a builder. The disappointment vanished, replaced by a burgeoning pride. "A debt," he repeated softly, testing the word. He nodded slowly. "Yes, I believe it is." He looked at her, truly seeing the woman she had become. "How do we begin?" Their first visit was to the Golden Slipper Saloon. They found Nellie Hart in her office, a place that smelled of whiskey and cigar smoke, but was as orderly as any banker's. They laid out the proposal for the miner's widow and orphan fund. Nellie listened without interruption, her fingers steepled under her chin. When they were finished, she was silent for a long moment. "You want me," she said, a hint of her old, cynical humor in her voice. A saloon keeper, to be in charge of a charity fund for widows. We want someone the town trusts to be honest with money, Alma said simply. And someone who is not afraid of a fight. The men respect you, and the women know you will not be cheated. A slow, genuine smile spread across Nellie's face. Well, I will be. You two are not just going to run this town, you are going to civilize it. She extended a hand across her desk. I am in, but my services do not come free. The fund will pay for a new dress for me. Once a year, a respectable one. Their next stop was Dr. Maddox. They found him in his small office, patching up a miner who had gotten into a brawl. When the man had left, grumbling. They explained the second part of their plan, a small clinic, funded by the company, offering reduced-cost medical care to the miners and their families. The doctor listened, dabbing at a cut on his own knuckle. So you want me to work for half my usual fee? Patching up the same fools who will just go out and get into another fight next week, he grumbled. We want you to keep them healthy enough to work, Levi countered. A sick miner does not dig any gold. And a healthy family makes for a happier man, Alma added quietly. The doctor looked from one to the other, his one good eye surprisingly sharp. You are a dangerous pair, he said, but there was no malice in it. You will have this whole valley running on common sense if you are not careful, he sighed, a theatrical sound of long suffering. Very well, but my contract will stipulate a regular supply of my preferred Irish whiskey, for medicinal purposes. Of course, with their allies in place, the real work began. The camp was transformed. A new large mess hall was built with a separate, cool stone-lined room for summer. Alma herself organized the evening literacy classes. Her first students a half-dozen miners who painstakingly traced the letters of their own names by lamplight. One evening, Levi called her into his office. On his desk, next to the familiar ledgers, was a new, official-looking document drawn up by a lawyer from the territorial capital. What is this, she asked. Read it, he said. She picked it up. It was not a marriage certificate. It was a partnership agreement. It legally named Alma Reyes as a junior partner in Cartwright & Company. It granted her a share of the profits, a voice in all operational decisions, and a significant measure of control over the new worker welfare programs. But it was the final clause, a section written in Levi's own strong, clear hand. That made her stop breathing. It was a new set of mandatory safety provisions for the mine, the required use of hard leather helmets, the provision of new, brighter carbide lamps for every worker, and a strict limit on the length of underground shifts to prevent exhaustion. It was the moralization of his wealth, a contract that valued the lives of his men as much as the gold they pulled from the earth. It was everything she had ever dreamed of for her people, written down in binding, legal ink. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Levi. A partnership is a partnership. He said simply, we build this together. A few days later, as the sun was setting, casting long purple shadows down the gulch, they stood by the main well. It was the heart of the camp, its stone walls worn smooth by the hands of 100 men, its water a source of life for everyone. They were alone. The sounds of the evening shift change echoed from the mine head, a familiar, comforting rhythm. Alma looked down into the dark, cool water. Are you sure about this? Levi, she asked, a teasing note in her voice. About making me a partner when I keep the books. I tend to reduce Dr. Maddox's liquor fines. Levi stood beside her, his shoulder almost touching hers. He looked not at the well, but at her, at the way the fading light caught the silver scar on her wrist. A small, genuine smile touched his lips. I am sure, he said, his voice a low rumble, as long as you do not reduce the flour budget. She laughed, a real, unburdened laugh. He reached out and took her hand, the one with the scar, lacing his fingers through hers. It was a comfortable, solid fit. Alma Reyes, he said, his voice suddenly serious, will you be my partner in all things? She turned to face him, her heart full. There in the quiet twilight, by the simple stone well that gave life to them all. She gave him her answer. Yes, Levi, in all things. Several years passed. Not like the turning of pages in a book, but like the slow, relentless grinding of the ore crushers, each day wearing away a little of the old world and revealing something new beneath. Silver Bend grew. The raw, desperate energy of a boomtown began to settle into the more permanent rhythms of a community. New storefronts with painted signs lined Main Street, and the sound of hammers building new houses was as common as the distant blast of dynamite from the mines. The land, however, remained unchanged. It was still a place of harsh beauty, of winds that cut to the bone and a sun that bleached the very color from the sky. It was a place that demanded strength, and it rewarded resilience. On the porch of the main house in Cartwright Gulch, which was now less a house and more the bustling administrative heart of a small, self-sufficient colony, Levi Cartwright watched the evening light turn the valley gold. His nephews, no longer small boys but lanky youths on the cusp of manhood, were engaged in a loud, chaotic game of horseshoes in the yard. A handful of smaller children, the sons and daughters of miners, chased a stray dog nearby, their laughter echoing in the crisp air. The camp was no longer just a place of work. It was a place of families, of life. His gaze, however, was fixed on one person. Alma. She was standing by the newly constructed supply depot, a clipboard in her hand, deep in a serious discussion with the camp foreman about a shipment of winter flour. She was not the girl he had first seen by the ore kilns. The fine, delicate lines of her youth had been weathered by the sun and the wind, leaving behind a warm, sun-browned confidence. Her dark hair, usually tied back in a practical knot, had strands of silver woven through it now, catching the light like veins of precious ore in dark rock. The scar on her wrist was a pale, silvery mark, a part of her story that she no longer bothered to hide. She was a partner, a planner, a matriarch, her authority as natural and undisputed as the mountains that cradled the valley. She was, by any conventional measure, no longer the prettiest girl in town. He thought back to that night on the porch after the fire, the night he had first spoken the words that had unlocked the vault of his heart. They felt truer now than they ever had then, deepened by years of shared struggle, shared laughter, and the quiet, steady work of building a life together. A slow smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. Alma finished her conversation with the foreman, making a final, decisive note on her clipboard. She turned and saw Levi watching her, and the tired, professional lines of her face softened. She walked toward the porch, her steps sure and steady. As she climbed the stairs, he spoke, his voice laced with the comfortable warmth of a long-running, private joke. Her beauty faded with time, he said, his voice carrying a low chuckle. But to the gold tycoon, she was still the prettiest girl in town. Alma stopped in front of him and raised an eyebrow. She looked down at his empty hands, then at the noisy chaos of the children in the yard, and then back at him. A wry, affectionate smile played on her lips. "You are the gold tycoon," she asked. "Then you can help me wash the dinner dishes." He laughed, a full, unburdened sound that carried across the yard. He stood up and put an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. They stood together for a moment, two pillars against the vastness of the West, watching the life they had built together unfold before them. Below them, the creek they had moved shimmered in the last rays of the setting sun, its new channel worn smooth and natural by the passing of the seasons. It flowed steady and true on the path they had chosen for it, a silver ribbon binding the past to the future. In the far distance, then, from down the valley, came a sound that was still new to these mountains, the faint, lonely cry of a train whistle, a promise of the changing world that was coming, a world full of new challenges and new promises. They were ready for it. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect, and remember to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help share this story with more people.